My ex-wife, Ryan Bennett said with a casual laugh as he lifted his glass slightly above the polished oak table. She left with nothing. The men around him chuckled politely, the kind of laughter that lived easily in expensive rooms where crystal glasses caught the warm glow of chandelier light and every chair cost more than most people's monthly rent. The private dining lounge on the 32nd floor overlooked downtown Chicago, where ribbons of headlights slid through the evening streets nearly 300 feet below. Ryan leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the past had already been written in permanent ink. Some people just aren't built for the real world, he added, shrugging as if the story were too ordinary to deserve much attention. Across the table, a venture capitalist in a navy suit raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. How long ago was that? Ryan swirled the amber liquid in his glass before answering. 5 years. Maybe 6. I stopped counting. Outside the tall windows the wind brushed softly against the glass, but inside the room the air smelled of grilled steak, leather chairs, and the quiet pride of men celebrating a successful acquisition. Ryan Bennett had every reason to celebrate tonight. His company had just finalized a multimillion-dollar deal that morning, and the investors seated around him were eager to toast the future. Yet somehow the conversation had drifted toward the past, toward the woman he once married and barely thought about anymore. Or at least that was what he believed. So she just disappeared? Someone asked. Ryan smiled faintly. Pretty much. She packed a small suitcase and walked out of our house with maybe a few $100 to her name. I told her she'd regret leaving, but people hear what they want to hear. He took a slow sip and set the glass down, the ice clinking softly. The memory itself didn't hurt. If anything, it felt like proof that he had made the right choice. Olivia Bennett had been quiet, thoughtful, always sketching plans and ideas in notebooks that never seemed to turn into real results. Ryan used to think ambition required sharp elbows and louder voices. Olivia had neither. So when the marriage collapsed under the pressure of failed investments and endless arguments about money, Ryan walked away convinced that he had been the one carrying the weight all along. The waiter approached with another bottle, refilling glasses with careful precision. Ryan glanced briefly toward the entrance of the lounge as the elevator doors down the corridor opened with a soft chime. Normally he wouldn't have noticed. But tonight the hallway fell strangely quiet for a moment, as if the building itself had paused between breaths. A pair of slow footsteps echoed against the marble floor outside the room. One of the investors turned his head first, curiosity flickering across his face. Then another. Ryan followed their gaze almost absent-mindedly. The door to the lounge opened. A woman stepped inside, the city lights catching briefly along the edge of her dark coat as she removed it with calm, unhurried movements. For a heartbeat Ryan simply stared, his mind refusing to connect the image in front of him with the memory buried somewhere in the past. Because standing there, composed and confident in a tailored charcoal suit, was the last person he ever expected to see again. Olivia Bennett. Ryan Bennett did not stand up at first because his mind was still trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Olivia Bennett stepped fully into the warm light of the dining lounge as if she had walked into rooms like this her entire life, calm and steady, her posture straight but relaxed. 5 years earlier he remembered a different woman standing in the doorway of their old house with a single suitcase resting beside her leg, and a quiet determination in her eyes that he had mistaken for weakness. Back then the house had been silent except for the ticking of a kitchen clock, and the distant hum of traffic outside their suburban Chicago street. Ryan had signed the final documents at the dining table while Olivia watched without interrupting. The lawyer had cleared his throat and slid the papers across the polished surface. Ryan remembered the exact sentence he had spoken while placing the pen down afterward. He had told her she would not last 6 months on her own. Olivia had simply nodded once as if the prediction were a piece of weather information instead of a judgment about her future. She had packed carefully that evening, folding each shirt into the small suitcase she brought from the closet. The closet itself had been mostly empty by the time she finished because Ryan had already claimed the house in the settlement along with nearly everything inside it. Olivia had paused briefly in the hallway before leaving, looking once toward the living room where sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Ryan had been standing beside the window then, arms crossed, confident in the quiet certainty that he had just closed the final chapter of an inconvenient marriage. When Olivia picked up the suitcase, he remembered the faint metallic sound of its wheels touching the tile by the front door. She had checked her phone once, perhaps looking at the bank balance that showed a number barely large enough to cover a few weeks of rent anywhere in the city. $320 remained in the account they once shared. Ryan had seen the screen when she set the phone down briefly on the counter. He had not said anything about it. At the time he believed that silence was generosity. Olivia had placed her laptop into her shoulder bag before leaving. The device was several years old, the corners worn smooth from constant use. Ryan remembered watching her zip the bag slowly as though every movement required careful attention. Then she had opened the front door. The cool evening air drifted into the hallway carrying the distant sound of a passing train somewhere across the city. For a moment she had turned slightly toward him, as if considering whether to say something important. Instead she spoke only one calm sentence. She said she hoped life would turn out well for both of them. Ryan had almost laughed then because he believed their futures were already decided. Olivia walked down the driveway without looking back, the suitcase rolling quietly behind her across the concrete. Ryan closed the door and returned to the living room, convinced that he had just watched someone step away from stability into a world that would not be kind to her. That was the last evening he ever expected to see Olivia Bennett. Yet now 5 years later, inside a private dining lounge 32 floors above downtown Chicago, Ryan watched that same woman cross the room with quiet confidence, and something unfamiliar stirred in the silence around the table, as every conversation faded and every pair of eyes slowly turned toward her. The quiet inside the dining lounge stretched for several long seconds as Olivia Bennett walked forward. With calm, measured steps, the soft sound of her heels touching the marble floor echoing gently beneath the warm glow of the chandelier above the table. Ryan Bennett felt the familiar room around him suddenly shift in a way he could not immediately explain. 5 minutes earlier the space had been filled with confident voices and easy laughter, the comfortable rhythm of businessmen celebrating another successful transaction in a city that rewarded certainty. Now the same men who had been leaning back in their chairs were sitting straighter, watching the woman crossing the room with a growing curiosity that seemed to spread silently from one seat to the next. Olivia reached the edge of the table and offered a polite, composed smile to the group as though she had stepped into a meeting she attended every week. Up close the years had changed her in ways Ryan could not fully process at first glance. The quiet woman he remembered had carried herself with careful caution, often standing slightly behind him at public events, allowing him to guide conversations while she listened. The woman standing here now looked entirely different. Her expression was steady, her posture confident, and her voice when she finally spoke carried a calm clarity that held the room without effort. She greeted the investors with professional courtesy before her eyes moved briefly toward Ryan. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ryan felt a strange tightening in his chest as old memories tried to align with the present reality in front of him. One of the investors broke the silence with a friendly tone, asking Olivia if she was part of the group joining them for the evening presentation. Olivia nodded slightly and set a slim leather folder on the table with an easy motion. She explained that she had arrived early to review a few final documents before the formal introduction later that night. Ryan noticed the logo embossed in silver on the folder, but did not immediately recognize it. His attention remained fixed on Olivia herself, on the calm confidence that surrounded her like an invisible current. 5 years ago he had watched her leave their house with a single suitcase and a laptop that struggled to hold a charge for more than a few hours. Now she stood inside one of the most exclusive business lounges in downtown Chicago, as if she belonged there. More than anyone else in the room, the investor seated beside Ryan leaned forward with interest and asked Olivia which firm she represented. Olivia answered without hesitation, naming a company that caused several people at the table to exchange surprised glances. Ryan felt a faint sense of confusion begin to grow because he recognized the name. Over the past year the company had quietly appeared in multiple headlines connected to large technology acquisitions and strategic investments across the country. He had assumed it was run by a group of older executives, or perhaps a major investment fund based on the East Coast. The possibility that Olivia might be connected to it had never once crossed his mind. Olivia continued speaking with the same calm tone as she described the purpose of the evening meeting, and the upcoming announcement that would soon take place in the ballroom downstairs. While she spoke the room listened carefully, the earlier laughter replaced by focused attention. Ryan watched the investors nod thoughtfully as they absorbed each detail. For the first time that evening he realized that every person at the table was looking at Olivia not as a guest but as someone whose presence carried quiet authority. And somewhere beneath the polished confidence he had shown all night, Ryan Bennett felt a single unsettling thought begin to form. The woman he believed had walked away from everything might not have disappeared at all. She might have been building something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Ryan Bennett felt the conversation around the table slowly reorganize itself around Olivia Bennett, as if the entire room had quietly shifted its center of gravity. Only minutes earlier he had been the one guiding the discussion, explaining projections and future expansions with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the direction of every deal unfolding that night. Now he found himself listening while Olivia calmly answered questions from investors who only moments ago had been addressing him. One of the senior partners leaned forward with clear interest and asked Olivia how long she had been with the firm she mentioned earlier. Olivia rested one hand lightly on the back of an empty chair and answered in the same composed tone she had used since entering the room. She explained that the company had started small several years earlier with a handful of remote engineers and analysts, who believed that new technologies would reshape how mid-sized businesses operated across the country. She spoke about long nights of planning, small early contracts that barely covered operating costs, and the slow process of building trust with partners who were willing to take risks on an unfamiliar name. Ryan listened carefully as she described the first office they rented above a quiet retail store in a neighborhood nearly 12 miles from downtown Chicago. The space had only 2 windows and a heating system that struggled during winter storms, yet the team worked there every day refining a software platform designed to help companies manage complex financial forecasting. Olivia explained that the first version of the system had been written almost entirely on an aging laptop because that was the only equipment available at the time. Ryan felt an uncomfortable recognition when she mentioned the laptop. The description matched the same device he remembered seeing in her bag the night she walked out of their house. The investors exchanged thoughtful looks as Olivia continued outlining the path that slowly transformed the small startup into a company capable of negotiating national contracts. She spoke about setbacks with calm honesty and explained how each challenge forced them to improve their systems and expand their network of partners across several states. The quiet confidence in her voice suggested someone who had spent years solving problems rather than complaining about them. Ryan noticed that no one interrupted her because every detail sounded measured and credible. The investor seated closest to Olivia eventually asked the question that had begun forming in Ryan's own mind. He asked whether she had been involved from the beginning, or if she joined the company later during its expansion phase. Olivia offered a small thoughtful smile before answering. She said she had been there from the very first day when the company existed only as a collection of ideas written across several notebooks, and a single business plan saved on a laptop that was already outdated at the time. The words settled over the table slowly. Ryan glanced again at the silver logo stamped into the leather folder resting near her hand, and suddenly the letters began to look familiar in a way they had not only moments earlier. For the first time that evening, he felt the uncomfortable awareness that the story unfolding in front of him might be far larger than a simple business introduction. And as the city lights continued to shimmer through the tall windows behind them, Ryan Bennett began to understand that the woman he once believed would not survive on her own might have spent the last 5 years quietly building something powerful enough to change everything he thought he knew. The quiet discussion around the table gradually shifted from curiosity to focused attention as Olivia Bennett finished describing the early years of the company, and Ryan Bennett could sense that something important was approaching, even though no one had said it directly yet. The investors sitting beside him exchanged subtle looks of interest, the kind that experienced business leaders shared when they realized a story was leading somewhere significant. One of them adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, studying the silver emblem on the leather folder resting near Olivia's hand. He asked a simple question in a thoughtful voice, asking whether the firm she described was connected to the rapidly growing technology group that had recently completed several strategic acquisitions across the Midwest and the West Coast. Olivia answered with calm clarity, explaining that the company had indeed expanded during the last 3 years, after a series of partnerships helped accelerate their platform into larger markets. She spoke about new offices opening in Austin, Denver, and Seattle, each location supporting teams of analysts and engineers who were refining the system that had begun years earlier with a simple concept and a great deal of persistence. Ryan listened as the details unfolded, and felt a slow realization forming somewhere behind his steady expression. The name of the company had appeared in financial news several times during the past year, always linked to innovative forecasting software and unexpectedly strong growth in competitive industries. At the time, Ryan had assumed the company was led by experienced executives backed by a powerful investment firm somewhere in New York or Silicon Valley. He had never once considered that Olivia might be connected to it in any meaningful way. The investor across the table finally asked the question that brought a deeper silence into the room. He asked who had founded the company in the first place. For a moment Olivia looked toward the tall windows where the city lights stretched across the dark Chicago skyline nearly 300 feet below them. When she turned back, her expression remained calm and thoughtful, the same quiet confidence that had settled over the entire room since she arrived. She explained that the company began as a single idea written across several pages of notes during a long winter evening, in a small apartment 12 miles from downtown. At the time, she had been working during the day and studying financial models at night, while slowly refining a platform designed to help businesses understand the future direction of their markets. She described the early days when the entire operation consisted of one laptop, 2 freelance developers communicating through video calls, and a determination to prove that careful planning could create opportunity even in uncertain conditions. Ryan felt the room grow quieter with every sentence because the timeline Olivia described matched the exact period after she left their house with the small suitcase he remembered so clearly. One of the investors nodded with visible respect and asked the final question that seemed to hang in the air between everyone at the table. He asked who currently led the company as its chief executive officer. Olivia rested her hand lightly on the folder before her and answered in the same steady voice she had used since stepping into the lounge. She said that she had been leading the company since the day it officially opened its first bank account. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation earlier that evening. And for the first time, Ryan Bennett understood that the woman he once believed had walked away with nothing had quietly built an entire world while he was not looking. The silence after Olivia Bennett finished speaking settled across the table like a slow-moving tide, and for several seconds no one seemed eager to break it. The investors looked at one another with quiet respect, the kind that appeared when a story suddenly revealed far more depth than anyone expected at the beginning of a conversation. Ryan Bennett sat still in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the side of his glass although he had forgotten to drink from it. He replayed her words in his mind, trying to align them with the memories he carried from 5 years earlier. The woman he once watched roll a single suitcase down the driveway had just calmly explained how she built a company that now operated offices across several major American cities. The difference between those two images was difficult to measure. One of the investors finally spoke, his voice thoughtful rather than surprised. He congratulated Olivia on the scale of growth her company had achieved in such a short period of time, and asked what had convinced her to pursue such an ambitious idea in the first place. Olivia listened carefully before answering. She explained that the original concept came from watching small and medium-sized businesses struggle to understand long-term financial planning. Many companies relied on short forecasts that only looked a few months ahead, leaving them vulnerable when markets shifted unexpectedly. She believed there was a better way to use data and predictive modeling to help companies prepare for years rather than quarters. The explanation was clear and confident, the tone of someone who had repeated the idea many times to investors and partners across the country. As she spoke, Ryan noticed the quiet assurance in her posture, the steady rhythm of someone who had grown comfortable explaining complex ideas to powerful people. 5 years earlier, he remembered Olivia speaking softly during dinner conversations, often pausing before sharing her thoughts while he dominated the discussion with louder opinions. Now the room listened to her without interruption. Another investor asked how the company managed to scale so quickly once the first contracts began appearing. Olivia described how early clients recommended the platform to other businesses within their networks, creating a steady wave of introductions that expanded their reach across several industries. She also explained that the company reinvested nearly every dollar of early profit back into improving the system and expanding the engineering team. Ryan found himself paying close attention to the timeline she described. The growth pattern matched the same sequence of news articles he had skimmed over the past year, while reading financial updates during flights between meetings. He remembered thinking at the time that the company behind those headlines must have had remarkable leadership guiding its strategy. Now that leadership was standing only a few feet away from him. The waiter returned quietly to refill water glasses while the conversation continued, but Ryan barely noticed the movement. His attention remained fixed on Olivia as she answered each question with calm precision. The quiet woman he once believed would struggle to navigate the world alone had transformed into someone who spoke about national business expansion with steady confidence. And as the lights of Chicago continued glowing beyond the tall windows behind them, Ryan Bennett slowly realized that the story he believed had ended 5 years earlier had only been the beginning of something far greater than he ever imagined. Ryan Bennett remained quiet while the conversation continued around the table, yet inside his mind something unsettled had begun to take shape. The investors were now asking Olivia Bennett questions with the kind of interest normally reserved for leaders whose companies had already proven their strength in competitive markets. Each answer she gave was calm and thoughtful, never rushed, never defensive. Ryan noticed that she listened carefully before responding, allowing each question to finish before explaining her perspective in clear and measured language. It was a subtle leadership style, different from the confident speeches he often delivered during negotiations. Olivia did not try to dominate the conversation. Instead, she guided it with steady patience, and the room naturally leaned toward her words. One of the senior investors eventually asked how the company managed to gain attention from such large partners in such a short period of time. Olivia paused briefly before answering, as if considering how much of the story to share. She explained that the first major opportunity came almost by accident during the second year of development. At the time, the team had been testing an early version of their forecasting platform with several small manufacturing companies located about 60 miles outside Chicago. The software helped those businesses analyze supply chain patterns months in advance, allowing them to prepare for changes in demand before they happened. One of those companies later introduced Olivia to a regional distributor that was struggling with unpredictable seasonal demand. When the distributor implemented the system and saw measurable improvements within the first quarter, the news spread quickly through its network of partners. Olivia described how that single introduction opened doors across multiple industries, including transportation, logistics, and energy management firms that required precise long-term forecasting. Ryan listened carefully as the story unfolded, recognizing the kind of organic growth most entrepreneurs spent years trying to achieve. It was not the result of a single dramatic breakthrough, but rather a chain of trust built slowly through consistent results. Olivia also explained that she and her team remained careful about which partnerships they accepted, focusing only on clients willing to adapt their operations to fully use the forecasting models. The discipline of that strategy allowed the company to maintain reliability, even while expanding across new states. The investors nodded with growing admiration as she spoke. Ryan felt an unfamiliar mixture of surprise and reflection settle in his thoughts. 5 years earlier, he had believed Olivia lacked the determination required to survive outside the stability he thought he provided. Yet the story she described tonight was built entirely on determination, patience, and quiet confidence. He realized that while he had been focused on growing his own company through traditional acquisitions and financial leverage, Olivia had been constructing something equally powerful in a completely different way. The realization did not arrive as a sudden shock, but rather as a gradual understanding that the past he once dismissed had continued evolving long after he stopped paying attention. As the evening moved forward and the lights of Chicago shimmered beyond the tall windows, Ryan Bennett began to see that the woman he once believed would struggle alone had spent years building a future strong enough to stand directly beside the one he thought only he controlled. The conversation in the lounge continued with a quiet momentum that no one seemed eager to interrupt, and the atmosphere had shifted so completely that Ryan Bennett almost forgot how the evening had begun. Only an hour earlier he had been the center of attention, describing expansion plans for his own company, while the investors listened with polite enthusiasm. Now the rhythm of the room belonged to Olivia Bennett, and every new question seemed to reveal another layer of the journey she had taken during the years he assumed she had disappeared into obscurity. One of the younger investors leaned forward with genuine curiosity, and asked how Olivia managed the pressure during those early years when the company had no guarantee of success. Olivia smiled slightly, not with pride but with the quiet recognition of someone remembering a difficult road. She explained that the beginning required patience more than confidence. Every week brought new challenges that could have easily ended the project if the team had allowed doubt to guide their decisions. Some months the revenue barely covered operating costs, and there were evenings when she wondered whether the idea would ever move beyond the small network of businesses that first trusted the system. Yet she described how those same challenges also sharpened their focus. Instead of chasing rapid expansion, they concentrated on improving the accuracy of their forecasting models and building relationships with clients who believed in long-term planning. Ryan listened carefully as Olivia spoke about those years. He remembered how he once believed ambition required visible victories and loud announcements, but the story she was telling sounded completely different. Her success had grown quietly through consistency rather than spectacle. Another investor asked what finally pushed the company into national recognition. Olivia explained that the turning point arrived when a logistics firm based nearly 900 miles away in Dallas implemented the platform to manage seasonal shipping demand across multiple states. The results exceeded expectations within the first year, and the firm began recommending the system to partners throughout its distribution network. That single connection expanded into contracts across transportation, manufacturing, and energy companies that required reliable long-term planning. The chain of partnerships spread slowly at first, and then more rapidly as new clients shared their results with others. Ryan felt a strange sense of distance while listening, as though he were observing the life of someone he thought he knew but had never truly understood. 5 years earlier he had believed Olivia would struggle to adapt without the financial stability he controlled. Now the investors at the table were studying her with clear respect, recognizing the discipline and persistence required to build a company that could influence entire industries. Olivia finished answering another question and reached for the glass of water placed beside her folder. Her movements remained calm and unhurried, yet the quiet authority surrounding her presence had become unmistakable. Ryan noticed that no one was looking at him anymore when discussing the future of the deal being celebrated that evening. Instead, the investors occasionally glanced toward Olivia as though waiting for her thoughts before forming their own opinions. In that moment, Ryan Bennett began to sense that the story unfolding tonight might not only be about the company she built but about something else entirely. Something connected to the very deal that had brought all of them together in that private lounge high above the city lights of Chicago. The low hum of conversation inside the lounge gradually returned as the investors absorbed everything Olivia Bennett had shared. Yet the atmosphere had clearly shifted from casual discussion to careful attention. Ryan Bennett noticed that even the smallest details now seemed to revolve around her presence in the room. The investors who had once looked toward him for confirmation were now directing subtle questions in Olivia's direction, as if the evening had quietly rearranged its hierarchy without anyone announcing the change. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Chicago stretched across the night like a map of glowing streets, traffic flowing far below them nearly 300 feet beneath the glass. Inside the room, the waiter moved silently between chairs, refreshing water glasses and clearing plates while the conversation continued to build toward something Ryan could not yet fully see. One of the senior partners adjusted the cuff of his suit and asked Olivia how she decided which industries to focus on as her company expanded beyond its early contracts. Olivia answered thoughtfully, explaining that the decision had always been guided by a simple principle. Her team focused on sectors where long-term planning was essential but often misunderstood. Transportation networks, manufacturing chains, and energy providers all depended on accurate forecasts months, and sometimes years ahead of time. By refining the platform to handle complex data across those industries, the company gradually positioned itself as a strategic partner, rather than just another technology vendor. Ryan listened carefully while she described the approach, realizing how methodical the strategy sounded compared with the faster but riskier expansions he often pursued in his own business ventures. Another investor asked whether Olivia's company planned to enter financial services as well. Olivia paused briefly before answering, then explained that while several banks had shown interest in the system, her team preferred to strengthen their presence in operational industries first before expanding further into financial markets. The answer was careful and balanced, revealing a level of long-term discipline that impressed the people sitting around the table. Ryan noticed several nods of approval as she spoke. For a moment he wondered how many of these investors had already been following the growth of her company long before tonight's meeting. The realization made the room feel slightly smaller. One of the partners then glanced at the watch on his wrist and mentioned that the formal presentation for the evening would begin downstairs in the ballroom within the next 20 minutes. The purpose of the gathering, he reminded everyone, was to introduce the lead investor behind the acquisition that had been finalized earlier that morning. Ryan had been expecting that introduction all evening because the identity of the primary investor had been kept confidential during negotiations. He assumed the person would be a representative from one of the major investment firms that occasionally funded large technology deals across the country. As the group began gathering their folders and preparing to move toward the elevators, Ryan noticed Olivia calmly closing the silver-stamped folder she had placed on the table earlier. She stood with the same quiet confidence she had carried since entering the room. Several investors greeted her warmly as they prepared to leave, thanking her for sharing insights about her company. Ryan rose from his chair as well, his thoughts moving slowly through the events of the evening. Somewhere in the back of his mind a quiet suspicion had begun to form, a sense that Olivia's presence here was connected to more than just a casual business conversation. And as the group started walking toward the elevator that would take them down to the ballroom, Ryan Bennett felt the unmistakable feeling that the most important moment of the night had not yet happened. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime as the group stepped into the wide hallway that led toward the grand ballroom, and the energy of the evening began to shift again as more guests gathered near the entrance below. Ryan Bennett walked beside the investors he had been speaking with earlier, but his attention kept drifting toward Olivia Bennett, who moved calmly a few steps ahead of the group. The confidence in her stride was subtle yet unmistakable, the kind that came from years of navigating rooms filled with powerful decision-makers. 5 years ago he had believed the world outside their marriage would overwhelm her. Now he watched her walk through one of the most influential gatherings of business leaders in Chicago as though she had always belonged there. The elevator carried everyone down more than 30 floors before the doors opened again onto the main reception level. A wide corridor led toward the ballroom where soft music drifted through the open entrance, and a warm glow from tall chandeliers illuminated hundreds of conversations unfolding across the room. Executives, investors, and analysts from across the country had gathered for the evening announcement connected to the acquisition finalized earlier that day. Ryan stepped into the ballroom and immediately recognized several familiar faces from past conferences and negotiations. Waiters moved between small groups offering sparkling water and coffee, while a large stage at the far end of the room displayed a projection screen with the logo of the company involved in the acquisition. The atmosphere carried the quiet anticipation that always surrounded major business announcements. Ryan had been told earlier that the identity of the lead investor behind the deal would finally be revealed tonight. During the negotiations, the primary funding source had remained confidential, represented only through a legal team and a series of secure financial transfers that made the transaction possible. Ryan had assumed the investor would be a large institution from New York, or perhaps a global technology fund based in California. As the guests continued arriving, the host of the event stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the evening presentation. Conversations slowly softened as people turned their attention toward the front of the room. Ryan found himself standing with several investors from the lounge while Olivia positioned herself quietly near the side of the stage. At first he assumed she had moved there simply to gain a better view of the presentation. The host spoke briefly about the importance of innovation in modern industry, and described the acquisition as a major step toward expanding advanced forecasting technology across multiple sectors. The audience listened with growing interest while the lights dimmed slightly above the stage. Then the host paused and smiled toward the crowd before continuing. He explained that the deal being celebrated that night had been made possible by a strategic investor who believed strongly in the future of predictive systems and long-term planning. Ryan folded his arms lightly as he waited to hear the name of the firm behind the funding. Around him several people leaned closer together with the same curiosity. The host then said that instead of announcing the investor through a corporate representative, the person responsible for leading the investment had agreed to introduce the vision personally. At that moment the stage lights shifted slightly toward the side where Olivia Bennett had been standing quietly since entering the ballroom. Ryan felt his breath pause for a single second as the host turned in that direction and extended his hand in invitation. And suddenly every eye in the room followed the same line of light toward the woman Ryan once believed had walked away with nothing. For a brief moment the entire ballroom seemed to pause as the host's gesture directed the attention of hundreds of guests toward the side of the stage. Olivia Bennet stepped forward with calm, unhurried confidence, the soft light from the overhead fixtures following her path as she walked toward the center of the platform. Ryan Bennet stood among the crowd roughly 30 feet away, yet the distance suddenly felt much greater as the realization forming in his mind began to settle with quiet certainty. The host greeted Olivia with a respectful smile before handing her the microphone, then stepped aside while the room waited. Conversations faded completely as the audience recognized that the person about to speak was not simply another executive, but the individual responsible for guiding the investment behind the acquisition. Everyone had gathered to celebrate. Olivia paused for a moment as she looked across the audience, allowing the silence to settle naturally before she began. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom, calm and steady without any hint of hesitation. She thanked the guests for attending and spoke briefly about the importance of thoughtful innovation in industries that rely on accurate long-term planning. Many of the people in the room had spent years navigating unpredictable markets, and her words reflected an understanding of those challenges that resonated across the audience. Ryan listened carefully, noticing how effortlessly she addressed the crowd. 5 years earlier he had believed public speaking would make her uncomfortable. Now she stood beneath the bright stage lights guiding the attention of an entire ballroom filled with experienced investors and executives. Olivia continued by explaining that the acquisition being celebrated that evening represented more than a financial transaction. It was part of a broader strategy to expand predictive technology that could help companies prepare for complex economic changes years before they appeared. She spoke about the responsibility that came with guiding such growth, and the importance of building partnerships based on trust, rather than short-term advantage. The clarity of her message drew quiet nods from several industry leaders standing near the front of the room. After outlining the vision behind the investment, Olivia finally addressed the announcement everyone had been waiting for. She explained that her company had spent the last 3 years quietly building the financial capacity to support strategic acquisitions that aligned with its long-term platform. The deal completed earlier that morning was the first of several steps designed to expand their technology into additional industries across the country. As the meaning of her words spread through the crowd, the host returned briefly to the microphone and confirmed what many guests were beginning to realize. The lead investor behind the acquisition was not an outside institution at all. It was Olivia Bennet's company. A soft wave of surprised murmurs moved through the ballroom as people exchanged glances of recognition. Ryan remained completely still where he stood, his mind replaying every assumption he had carried into the evening. The woman he once believed had left with almost nothing was now standing on a stage, introducing an investment powerful enough to reshape the future of the very industry he had spent years trying to dominate. And as the applause slowly filled the ballroom, Ryan Bennet understood that the quiet confidence he had noticed earlier in the lounge had never been accidental. Olivia had walked into the room already knowing exactly how the night would end. The applause that filled the ballroom rose gradually at first, and then grew stronger as the meaning of Olivia Bennet's announcement settled across the audience. Executives, analysts, and investors who had spent years studying market shifts now understood that the acquisition celebrated that evening had not been orchestrated by an outside corporation or an anonymous investment fund. It had been led by the same woman who only moments earlier had been quietly answering questions in a private lounge upstairs. Olivia stood calmly beneath the stage lights while the applause continued, her expression steady and thoughtful rather than triumphant. When the room finally grew quiet again, she spoke once more, explaining that the purpose of the investment was not simply expansion but preparation. Markets were changing quickly, she said, and companies that relied only on short-term thinking often discovered the future arriving faster than expected. Her team believed that better forecasting tools could help organizations navigate those changes with confidence instead of uncertainty. The clarity of her message resonated throughout the room because nearly every leader present had faced moments when unpredictable shifts challenged their long-term plans. Ryan Bennet remained among the crowd, standing only a short distance from the stage yet feeling as though he were observing the moment from somewhere far away. The applause, the stage lights, and the steady voice of Olivia speaking to the audience blended into a single realization that slowly replaced every assumption he had carried for years. 5 years earlier he believed success belonged to those who moved faster, spoke louder, and controlled every negotiation with visible authority. Olivia had taken a completely different path. She built something quietly, step by step, without needing recognition from anyone who once doubted her ability to succeed. As the presentation concluded, the host returned to the stage to thank Olivia for sharing the vision behind the investment. Guests began discussing the announcement in excited conversations across the ballroom, many of them already speculating about how the new technology platform would influence their industries in the coming years. Olivia stepped down from the stage and was quickly surrounded by executives eager to introduce themselves. Ryan watched as several respected investors approached her with clear admiration, congratulating her on the scale of the achievement. She responded to each of them with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening. Eventually, the small circle of guests around her shifted slightly, and for a brief moment her gaze moved across the room. Her eyes met Ryan's for the first time since she stepped onto the stage. The expression she offered was simple and composed, neither distant nor emotional, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone recognizing a familiar face from another chapter of life. Ryan nodded slightly without realizing he had done so. No words were exchanged, and none were necessary. In that silent moment, Ryan Bennett finally understood that the past he once believed had ended in his favor had only been the beginning of a journey that led Olivia Bennett somewhere far beyond the life he thought she would never manage to build. The conversations across the ballroom continued long after the formal presentation ended. Yet for Ryan Bennett, the noise of the room had softened into something distant, like the faint echo of traffic heard from the top of a tall building. Executives gathered in small circles discussing the implications of the investment Olivia Bennett had just introduced. Analysts spoke excitedly about new forecasting systems that could reshape entire industries, and investors exchanged business cards with the quiet urgency that followed any major announcement. But Ryan remained still for a moment longer, watching the movement of the crowd around the woman he once believed would struggle to survive without him. Olivia stood near the center of a small group of executives who had approached her after the presentation, listening to their questions with the same calm focus she had shown throughout the evening. There was no hint of arrogance in the way she spoke, no attempt to display triumph over anyone who had doubted her in the past. Instead, she carried herself with the steady composure of someone who understood that success did not need to be announced loudly to be recognized. Ryan slowly stepped away from the place where he had been standing and moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near the tall windows. Outside, the night skyline of Chicago stretched across the horizon in ribbons of light, each street and building part of a city that never stopped changing. 5 years earlier, he had watched Olivia walk away from a life he believed she could never replace. At the time, he had been certain that stability belonged to him alone. Yet standing there now, he realized how narrow that certainty had been. Olivia had not returned tonight to prove anything to him. She had not mentioned the past or reminded him of the words he once spoke with such confidence. Instead, she had simply walked into the same world that once dismissed her, and quietly demonstrated what patience and determination could build over time. Ryan glanced once more toward the center of the ballroom where Olivia was finishing another conversation with a group of investors. For a brief moment she looked up and their eyes met again across the distance of the room. The look she offered was calm and respectful, not a challenge and not a victory. It was simply the acknowledgement of someone who had moved forward without bitterness. Ryan felt a small understanding settle within him then, the kind that arrived only after years of believing the wrong story about someone else. He raised his glass slightly in her direction, a quiet gesture of recognition. She answered with a polite nod before turning back to the conversation waiting for her. The music in the ballroom continued softly as the evening carried on around them. Deals would be discussed, partnerships would be formed, and the future of several industries would likely be influenced by the work Olivia Bennett had begun years earlier on a laptop in a small apartment. But for Ryan Bennett, the most important realization had already happened. The woman he once believed had left with nothing had never been searching for revenge. She had simply been building a life strong enough that one day the world would see exactly who she had become.